The morning sun cast long shadows across the Naval Special Warfare Training Center in Coronado, California. 300 Navy SEALs filled the massive training amphitheater, their desert combat uniforms creating a sea of tan and brown. The air buzzed with anticipation as they waited for what promised to be an extraordinary demonstration. At the center of the arena stood Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chun, a compact woman of 5 feet 4 inches whose calm demeanor masked years of intensive martial arts training. Her black hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her dark eyes surveyed the crowd with quiet confidence. She had been invited to demonstrate close-quarters combat techniques to some of America's most elite warriors. The SEALs had initially been skeptical when they learned their instructor would be a woman. These were men who had survived Hell Week, completed countless dangerous missions, and prided themselves on being the toughest fighters in the world. Many exchanged glances and whispered comments when Sarah first walked onto the training floor. Master Chief Petty Officer Jake Morrison sat in the front row, his massive frame taking up nearly 2 seats. At 6 feet 5 inches and weighing 260 pounds, he was known throughout the SEAL community as one of the strongest and most aggressive fighters. His scarred hands told stories of countless battles, both in training and in the field across 3 combat deployments. Morrison had served for 15 years and had never lost a hand-to-hand combat match. He took pride in his reputation as someone who could take down any opponent, regardless of their training or background. When he heard that a female officer would be teaching them combat techniques, he felt personally insulted. Sarah began her presentation by explaining the principles of leverage and momentum in close-quarters combat. She spoke clearly and confidently, her voice carrying across the amphitheater without strain. She demonstrated basic techniques on a volunteer, showing how proper form could overcome size and strength advantages. The SEALs watched with growing interest as Sarah effortlessly threw a 200-pound volunteer across the mat. Her movements were fluid and precise, each technique executed with textbook perfection. She explained the physics behind each move, making complex martial arts principles accessible to fighters who relied primarily on strength and aggression. Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had expected to see basic self-defense moves, not sophisticated combat techniques. Still, his ego refused to accept that this woman could pose any real threat to someone of his size and experience. He whispered to the SEAL sitting next to him that any man worth his salt could overpower her if he really tried. Sarah called for questions from the audience. Several SEALs raised their hands, asking about specific scenarios they might encounter in the field. She answered each question thoroughly, often demonstrating the technique she described. Her knowledge was clearly extensive, covering everything from weapon retention to multiple attacker scenarios. The demonstration was scheduled to include a section on defending against larger, stronger attackers. Sarah explained that technique and timing were far more important than raw strength in these situations. She described how to use an attacker's momentum against them and how to target vulnerable points to maximum effect. Morrison's irritation grew with each successful demonstration. He felt that Sarah was showing off rather than teaching practical skills. In his mind, real combat was about aggression and dominance, not the fancy techniques she was displaying. He began to vocalize his skepticism more loudly, drawing annoyed looks from other SEALs. When Sarah asked for a volunteer to help demonstrate defense against a committed attack, Morrison's hand shot up immediately. The amphitheater fell silent as all eyes turned toward the massive SEAL. Sarah nodded professionally and gestured for him to join her on the mat. Morrison stood slowly, his impressive height becoming apparent as he towered over the other SEALs. He walked down to the mat with a swagger that made his intentions clear. This was not going to be a cooperative demonstration. He intended to show everyone that size and strength still mattered most in real combat. Sarah remained calm as Morrison approached. She had encountered skeptical students before, though rarely in such a public setting. She knew that how she handled this situation would determine whether the remaining SEALs took her seriously or dismissed her entirely. The reputation she had built over years of training was about to be tested. The two fighters faced each other in the center of the mat. Morrison stood with his hands on his hips, a condescending smile on his face. He was confident that his size advantage would allow him to control the demonstration regardless of what Sarah tried to do. Sarah explained to the audience that they would be demonstrating defense against an aggressive grab attempt. She instructed Morrison to attempt to grab her shoulders or arms as he might in a real confrontation. She emphasized that he should use realistic force and speed. Morrison nodded, though his expression suggested he had no intention of holding back. He had decided that it was time to put this instructor in her place. He believed that showing her limitations would actually be doing the other SEALs a favor by keeping them focused on practical reality rather than fancy demonstrations. The crowd grew more attentive as they sensed the tension building between the two fighters. Many of the SEALs knew Morrison's reputation and wondered how Sarah would handle his aggressive approach. Others were curious to see whether her techniques would work against someone who was not cooperating with the demonstration. Sarah took a defensive stance, her feet positioned for maximum mobility and balance. Her hands were raised in a non-threatening but ready position. She reminded Morrison that the demonstration was meant to be realistic but controlled, emphasizing safety for both participants. Morrison's response was a grunt that suggested he had little interest in safety considerations. He began to circle Sarah like a predator, his massive hands flexing as he prepared to make his move. The atmosphere in the amphitheater grew tense as 300 elite warriors watched the confrontation develop. Without warning, Morrison lunged forward with surprising speed for such a large man. His intention was clearly to grab Sarah and demonstrate his physical superiority through sheer force. His hands reached toward her with the confidence of someone who had never been successfully resisted by a smaller opponent. What happened next would be talked about in SEAL training facilities for years to come. Sarah moved with lightning-fast precision, her body seeming to flow around Morrison's attack like water around a stone. Her response was not the cooperative demonstration that everyone had expected to see. Morrison's hands shot forward with the speed and force of someone accustomed to overwhelming opponents through pure aggression. His fingers spread wide as he aimed to grab Sarah's shoulders and demonstrate his dominance in front of the assembled SEALs. The confidence in his movements showed he expected this to be over quickly and decisively. Sarah's response was immediate and devastating. As Morrison's right hand reached for her, she stepped slightly to her left while simultaneously grabbing his wrist with both hands. Her movement was so fluid that it appeared almost choreographed, though every SEAL watching knew this was completely unrehearsed. The physics of what happened next were simple but brutal. Sarah used Morrison's forward momentum against him while applying precise leverage to his extended arm. She pivoted on her left foot while maintaining her grip on his wrist, creating a fulcrum that turned his own strength into a weapon against himself. Morrison's face showed sudden confusion as he realized he was no longer in control of the situation. His forward motion continued despite his attempts to stop, and Sarah's technique amplified every pound of force he had committed to his attack. The massive SEAL found himself moving in directions he had not intended. Sarah's second hand moved to Morrison's elbow, applying pressure that worked in perfect coordination with her wrist control. The technique was called an arm bar, but her execution was flawless enough to make it look effortless. Morrison's arm was now caught in a mechanical disadvantage that his strength could not overcome. The amphitheater erupted in surprised shouts as Morrison's feet left the ground. Sarah's technique had converted his horizontal attack into a downward trajectory that sent him tumbling toward the mat. His massive frame, which had seemed so intimidating moments before, now worked against him as gravity took over. Morrison hit the mat hard, his shoulder taking most of the impact. The sound echoed throughout the amphitheater, causing many SEALs to wince in sympathy. But Sarah was not finished with her demonstration. She maintained control of his arm while following him to the ground, her technique flowing seamlessly from standing to ground control. Within seconds, Morrison found himself face down on the mat with Sarah controlling his right arm in a position that made resistance impossible. Her knee was placed strategically across his back, and any attempt to move caused immediate pain in his shoulder and elbow. The takedown had been so quick that many spectators were still processing what they had witnessed. The massive SEAL struggled against Sarah's control, his face red with embarrassment and anger. His free hand pushed against the mat as he tried to use his superior strength to escape the hold. But every movement he made only increased the pressure on his trapped arm, making his situation worse rather than better. Sarah's voice remained calm and professional as she explained the technique to the watching SEALs. She described how she had used Morrison's momentum and weight against him, turning his advantages into disadvantages through proper positioning and timing. Her explanation was clear and educational despite the dramatic nature of the demonstration. Morrison's struggles became more desperate as he realized that brute force would not free him from Sarah's control. His military training had taught him dozens of ways to escape from holds, but none of them worked when his opponent had such perfect positioning and leverage. The arm bar was textbook perfect, leaving him no mechanical advantage to exploit. The watching SEALs began to murmur among themselves as they witnessed something unprecedented. Morrison was known throughout their community as an unstoppable force in hand-to-hand combat. Seeing him completely controlled by someone half his size challenged everything they thought they knew about fighting. Sarah continued her explanation while maintaining perfect control over her struggling opponent. She pointed out how Morrison's strength was actually working against him in this position. Every muscle fiber he used to try to escape only increased the stress on his trapped arm and made her control more secure. Morrison's breathing became labored as the reality of his situation sank in. He was not just being held down. He was being dominated in front of 300 of his peers. His reputation as an unbeatable fighter was crumbling with each passing second that he remained trapped on the mat. The technique Sarah had used was called a flying arm bar, though her execution had been so smooth that it looked more like a dance than a combat move. She had taken Morrison from standing to complete submission in less than 3 seconds, using nothing but leverage and timing to defeat his size and strength advantages. Some of the watching SEALs began to applaud, recognizing the skill they had just witnessed. Others sat in stunned silence, trying to understand how such a dramatic reversal had occurred so quickly. Morrison had gone from confident aggressor to helpless victim in the blink of an eye. Sarah asked Morrison if he was ready to continue with the demonstration or if he needed a moment to recover. Her tone was professional and respectful, showing no signs of gloating despite her impressive victory. She treated the situation as a teaching moment rather than a personal triumph. Morrison's response was a grunt that could have meant anything. His pride was clearly wounded, but his arm was beginning to ache from the sustained pressure of the hold. Sarah had positioned herself so that any movement on his part increased the stress on his joints, making escape impossible without risking serious injury. After holding the position long enough to make her point clear, Sarah released Morrison's arm and stood up smoothly. She offered her hand to help him to his feet, maintaining the professional demeanor of an instructor rather than a victor. Her gesture showed respect for Morrison despite his aggressive approach to the demonstration. Morrison ignored the offered hand and pushed himself to his feet, rotating his shoulder to work out the stiffness from the arm bar. His face was flushed with embarrassment, but he managed to nod acknowledgement of Sarah's skill. The massive SEAL had been humbled in front of his peers, and everyone in the amphitheater knew it. Sarah turned to address the crowd, using Morrison's attack as a perfect example of how proper technique could overcome significant size and strength disadvantages. She broke down each element of her response, explaining the footwork, hand positioning, and timing that had made her defense so effective. The SEALs listened with new attention and respect. What they had just witnessed was not luck or trickery, but the result of years of dedicated training and perfect understanding of combat physics. Sarah had demonstrated that skill and knowledge could triumph over raw physical attributes when applied correctly. Morrison remained on the mat area, ostensibly to continue assisting with the demonstration. In reality, he was struggling with the ego damage of being so thoroughly defeated. His entire identity was built around physical dominance, and Sarah had shattered that foundation in seconds. But Morrison's humiliation was about to become much worse. His pride had been wounded, but his anger was growing stronger than his embarrassment. As Sarah continued her explanation to the crowd, he began to plot how he might salvage his reputation and prove that what had happened was just a lucky accident. Morrison stood at the edge of the training mat, his massive frame trembling with barely controlled rage. The laughter and whispered comments from his fellow SEALs cut deeper than any physical wound he had ever received. His reputation as an unstoppable force had been shattered in front of 300 witnesses, and His pride demanded immediate restoration. Sarah continued her instruction, demonstrating additional techniques with other volunteers from the crowd. Each movement was precise and controlled, showing the assembled SEALs how leverage and timing could overcome almost any physical disadvantage. Her calm professionalism stood in stark contrast to Morrison's growing agitation. The massive SEAL watched every technique with growing resentment. In his mind, what had happened was not a demonstration of superior skill, but a humiliating trick that made him look weak in front of his peers. He convinced himself that Sarah had caught him off guard, and that in a real fight, the outcome would be completely different. Morrison's fellow SEALs were thoroughly impressed by Sarah's demonstration. They peppered her with questions about training methods, asking where they could learn similar techniques. The respect in their voices was obvious, and many commented that they had never seen such effective combat skills demonstrated so clearly. The praise directed toward Sarah only intensified Morrison's anger. He felt that the other SEALs were betraying their brotherhood by showing admiration for someone who had made one of their own look foolish. In his twisted logic, their enthusiasm was a personal attack on his status and reputation. Sarah called for questions about defending against multiple attackers, setting up a scenario that would involve several volunteers. Morrison immediately stepped forward, volunteering to be part of the attacking group. His eagerness was noted by several observant SEALs who recognized the dangerous look in his eyes. The demonstration began with 4 SEALs surrounding Sarah in a loose circle. The exercise was designed to show how positioning and movement could prevent attackers from coordinating their assault. Sarah explained each principle clearly while demonstrating the footwork and awareness needed to avoid being overwhelmed. Morrison positioned himself directly behind Sarah, waiting for his opportunity to grab her when she was distracted by the other attackers. His hands flexed repeatedly as he imagined redemption through a successful takedown that would restore his damaged reputation. He was no longer thinking about the educational value of the demonstration. The exercise began slowly, with each attacker taking turns approaching Sarah while she demonstrated proper defensive movement. Her techniques were fluid and effective, showing how to use attackers against each other while maintaining mobility and avoiding being pinned down or surrounded. Morrison grew impatient with the controlled pace of the demonstration. He wanted action that would allow him to prove his dominance, not careful instruction that highlighted Sarah's superior knowledge. His breathing became heavier as his anger and frustration continued to build toward a dangerous level. When Sarah turned her back to address the crowd about situational awareness, Morrison saw his chance for revenge. He lunged forward without warning, intending to grab her from behind and show everyone that her earlier victory had been nothing but luck. His attack was driven by rage rather than technique. Sarah's peripheral vision caught Morrison's movement just as his hands reached for her shoulders. Her response was instantaneous and devastating, born from years of training that had made defensive reactions automatic. She spun to face the threat while simultaneously deflecting his grasping hands. Morrison's momentum carried him forward into Sarah's perfectly timed counterattack. She grabbed his extended right arm with both hands while stepping aside to let his body weight work against him. Her movement was similar to her earlier technique, but adapted for the different angle of attack. The amphitheater fell silent as Morrison found himself airborne once again. Sarah's technique sent him flying in a high arc that ended with a thunderous crash onto the mat. This time, however, she maintained her grip on his arm throughout his flight, creating a situation that would have horrific consequences. Morrison's body hit the mat hard, but his arm remained in Sarah's control. The physics of the situation created enormous stress on his shoulder and elbow joints as his body weight, and momentum worked against the fixed position of his trapped limb. The sound that followed was audible throughout the entire amphitheater. The sharp crack of breaking bone echoed off the walls like a gunshot. Morrison's right arm snapped at the elbow with such force that several SEALs in the front row could actually see the unnatural angle that his forearm now made with his upper arm. The injury was immediately obvious and severe. Morrison's scream of pain was primal and awful, the sound of a strong man confronting agony beyond his experience. He rolled onto his side, clutching his shattered arm, his face white with shock and pain. The limb that had been his pride and weapon now hung useless and twisted. Sarah released her grip immediately upon hearing the bone snap, her face showing professional concern rather than satisfaction. She had not intended to cause serious injury, but Morrison's aggressive attack had left her no choice but to defend herself with full commitment. The break was the result of his own momentum and poor judgment. The assembled SEALs erupted in shocked exclamations and calls for medical assistance. Many jumped to their feet, some moving toward Morrison while others backed away from the horrific scene. The demonstration had become a medical emergency in the span of seconds. Medical personnel who were always present during training exercises rushed onto the mat with emergency equipment. They immediately began treating Morrison for what was obviously a severe compound fracture of his right elbow. The bone had not broken through the skin, but the damage was extensive and would require immediate surgery. Sarah stepped back to give the medical team room to work while maintaining a professional demeanor despite the dramatic turn of events. She answered questions from the base commander who had rushed down from the observation deck, explaining exactly what had happened and why she had been forced to defend herself so aggressively. Morrison continued to moan in pain as the medics worked to stabilize his arm for transport to the base hospital. His earlier confidence and aggression had been replaced by vulnerability and dependence on others for the most basic assistance. The transformation was complete and humiliating. The remaining SEALs watched in stunned silence as their colleague was prepared for evacuation. Many were processing what they had witnessed, while others were already spreading word of the incident throughout the base. Morrison's attack and its consequences would become legendary within hours. Sarah addressed the crowd briefly, explaining that what had happened was an unfortunate result of an uncontrolled attack during what should have been a cooperative demonstration. She emphasized that proper training environments required mutual respect and controlled aggression to prevent exactly this type of injury. As Morrison was loaded onto a stretcher for transport to the hospital, his eyes found Sarah across the crowded mat. The look he gave her was filled with pain and hatred, but also with a new understanding of exactly who he had chosen to challenge. His lesson in respect had been learned at a terrible cost. The medical team worked with practiced efficiency as they stabilized Morrison's shattered arm on the training mat. His face had gone from red with anger to pale gray with shock, sweat beading on his forehead as the reality of his injury became clear. The compound fracture would require immediate surgical intervention and months of rehabilitation. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chun stood quietly to one side, her professional composure intact despite the dramatic turn of events. Base Commander Captain Robert Hayes approached her with a grave expression, needing to understand exactly what had transpired during what was supposed to be a routine training demonstration. The 300 SEALs watched in stunned silence as their colleague was prepared for transport. Many were recording statements from witnesses, while others were already calling friends and family to spread word of the unprecedented incident. Morrison's attack and its consequences would become part of SEAL folklore within hours. Captain Hayes listened intently as Sarah provided a detailed account of Morrison's unprovoked attack from behind while she was addressing the crowd. Her explanation was clear and factual, focusing on the sequence of events that had led to the injury rather than Morrison's obvious hostility throughout the demonstration. Several SEALs stepped forward to corroborate Sarah's account, describing Morrison's increasingly aggressive behavior and his deliberate attack when her back was turned. Their testimonies painted a clear picture of an instructor defending herself against an assault rather than an accident during a cooperative exercise. The base commander's investigation would later reveal that Morrison had a history of disciplinary problems related to his treatment of female personnel. Multiple complaints had been filed over the years, though none had resulted in serious consequences due to his exemplary combat record and the protective culture within special operations units. Sarah's background check revealed an impressive record of martial arts achievements and military service. She held black belts in multiple disciplines and had served with distinction in various training roles throughout the Navy. Her expertise was beyond question, making Morrison's challenge even more foolish in retrospect. As the stretcher carrying Morrison was loaded into the ambulance, several of his closest friends followed to provide support during his hospital stay. Their faces showed shock and concern, but also a growing understanding that their friend had brought this injury upon himself through his aggressive behavior and poor judgment. The remaining SEALs gradually returned to their seats as Captain Hayes addressed the crowd. He praised Sarah's professionalism and skill while condemning the behavior that had led to the injury. His words made clear that Morrison's actions were not representative of the values expected from elite military personnel. Sarah resumed her demonstration with remarkable composure, using the incident as a teaching moment about the importance of controlled aggression and mutual respect in training environments. Her ability to continue teaching after such a dramatic confrontation impressed even the most skeptical SEALs in attendance. The questions that followed were more thoughtful and respectful than before, with SEALs seeking genuine instruction rather than attempting to challenge Sarah's credibility. Morrison's fate had served as a powerful reminder that skill and knowledge deserved recognition regardless of the instructor's size or gender. Word of the incident spread rapidly throughout the naval special warfare community via phone calls, text messages, and social media posts. By evening, SEALs stationed around the world knew that Master Chief Morrison had been humiliated and injured by a female instructor during a training demonstration. The story grew in the telling, with each version adding dramatic details that made Morrison look even more foolish and Sarah more impressive. Some versions had her breaking multiple bones, while others claimed she had defeated several attackers simultaneously. The truth was dramatic enough, but military folklore demanded embellishment. Morrison's surgery lasted 4 hours as orthopedic specialists worked to repair the extensive damage to his elbow joint. Multiple pins and screws were required to reconstruct the shattered bone, and the prognosis for full recovery was uncertain. His career as an elite warrior was effectively over. During his recovery, Morrison was forced to confront the reality that his actions had been witnessed by hundreds of his peers and recorded by base security cameras. There could be no denial or alternate explanation for what had happened. His humiliation was complete and permanent. The investigation into the incident revealed that Morrison had consumed alcohol before the demonstration, violating base regulations and impairing his judgment. This additional violation added disciplinary charges to his medical problems, ensuring that his military career would end in disgrace rather than honor. Sarah's demonstration was completed successfully despite the dramatic interruption, with the remaining SEALs showing genuine appreciation for her knowledge and skill. Many requested information about training opportunities, hoping to learn techniques that could enhance their own combat effectiveness. The base commander's final report praised Sarah's handling of a dangerous situation while condemning Morrison's unprofessional conduct. Her actions were deemed appropriate and necessary for self-defense, with no disciplinary action recommended. Morrison, however, faced court-martial proceedings in addition to his medical challenges. The incident became a case study in military training programs, illustrating the importance of respect and professionalism in instructional settings. Sarah's perfect execution of defensive techniques under pressure became an example of how proper training could overcome significant size and strength disadvantages. Morrison's fellow SEALs initially rallied around their injured colleague, but their support waned as details of his behavior emerged. Many began to distance themselves from someone whose actions had brought shame to their unit and violated the code of honor they lived by. The broken arm healed poorly despite multiple surgeries, leaving Morrison with permanent limitations that ended any hope of returning to active duty. His medical retirement was processed quickly, removing him from the special operations community he had disgraced with his behavior. Sarah continued her training duties with enhanced respect from students and colleagues alike. The incident had demonstrated her capabilities under extreme pressure and established her reputation as someone who could handle any situation with skill and professionalism. Her calendar became filled with requests for training demonstrations. The empty seat where Morrison once sat during team meetings served as a constant reminder to his former teammates about the consequences of disrespecting instructors and violating the principles of professional military conduct. His absence was noted but not mourned by those who understood what had really happened that day. 6 months after the incident, Master Chief Morrison sat in his small apartment near the San Diego Naval Base, staring at his twisted right arm that would never again function properly. The multiple surgeries had left him with limited mobility and constant pain, serving as daily reminders of the moment his arrogance had cost him everything. His medical retirement paperwork had been processed with unusual speed, reflecting the Navy's desire to remove him from active duty before his behavior could cause additional problems. The court-martial proceedings had resulted in a reduction in rank and forfeiture of benefits, leaving him with minimal pension and few prospects for civilian employment. The special operations community that had once been his entire world now viewed him as a cautionary tale rather than a respected warrior. Former colleagues avoided his calls, and his invitations to unit reunions and social gatherings had stopped coming. His disgrace was complete and permanent within the military circles that had defined his identity. Morrison's physical therapy sessions were painful reminders of his former capabilities. The exercises designed to restore limited function to his damaged arm were frustrating and demoralizing for someone who had once prided himself on superior physical strength. His therapist tried to remain encouraging, but progress was minimal. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chun had become one of the most sought-after defensive tactics instructors in the military. Her calendar was booked months in advance with requests from units throughout the armed forces who wanted their personnel trained by the woman who had defeated a Navy SEAL in front of 300 witnesses. The incident had been analyzed extensively in military journals and training publications, with Sarah's techniques becoming standard curriculum in several programs. Her perfect execution under pressure had elevated her from competent instructor to legendary figure within the martial arts community. Video footage of the confrontation, captured by base security cameras, had been classified but was widely discussed in professional circles. Those who had seen it praised Sarah's restraint and precision, noting that she had used exactly the amount of force necessary to stop Morrison's attack without employing potentially lethal techniques. Sarah received numerous job offers from civilian security firms and martial arts schools, but she chose to remain in military service where her skills could benefit the most people. Her dedication to teaching proper defensive techniques had been strengthened by the incident, knowing that her instruction could prevent similar confrontations. The 300 SEALs who witnessed the demonstration had carried the story throughout the special operations community and beyond. Many had requested follow-up training sessions with Sarah, eager to learn techniques that could give them advantages in close-quarters combat situations. Morrison's former teammates spoke of him rarely, and when they did, it was usually in the context of warning younger SEALs about the dangers of disrespecting instructors or letting ego override judgment. His name had become synonymous with unprofessional conduct and its consequences. The rehabilitation process had given Morrison time to reflect on the choices that led to his downfall. Slowly, painfully, he began to understand that his behavior had been inexcusable and that Sarah had been well within her rights to defend herself against his attack. This realization brought no comfort, only additional shame. His attempts to apologize to Sarah through official channels were politely declined, as she had moved on from the incident and preferred not to revisit the confrontation. Her focus remained on positive instruction rather than dwelling on past conflicts, even those that had enhanced her reputation significantly. The broader military community had embraced the incident as evidence that skill and training were more important than size and gender in determining combat effectiveness. Sarah's victory had become a rallying point for female service members facing skepticism about their capabilities in traditionally male-dominated roles. Morrison's apartment walls were bare of the commendations and photographs that had once displayed his military achievements. The reminders of his former success were too painful to look at, replaced by medical bills and disability paperwork that represented his new reality as a broken and disgraced veteran. Physical limitations prevented Morrison from pursuing most civilian careers that might have utilized his military experience. Security work was impossible with his damaged arm, and his reputation preceded him in any job interview within the defense contractor community where his story was well known. Sarah's influence extended beyond individual training sessions to policy recommendations about instructor qualifications and student conduct. Her experience had demonstrated the importance of maintaining professional standards and supporting instructors regardless of students' preconceptions or biases about their backgrounds. The incident had also sparked conversations about alcohol policies during training events, leading to stricter enforcement and monitoring procedures designed to prevent similar judgment failures. Morrison's drinking before the demonstration had been a contributing factor that military leadership was determined not to repeat. Years later, when new SEALs arrived at training facilities, they were often told the story of Morrison's downfall as part of their orientation about proper conduct and respect for instructors. The tale served as both entertainment and education, ensuring that his disgrace would continue teaching lessons long after his departure. Morrison eventually found work as a night security guard at a civilian facility, a job that required little physical capability and minimal background investigation. The position paid barely enough to cover his expenses, a dramatic fall from his former status as an elite warrior earning special operations pay. His social isolation was complete, as civilian friends struggled to understand his military background, while military contacts wanted nothing to do with his tarnished reputation. He spent most evenings alone, reliving the moment when his arrogance had destroyed everything he had worked 15 years to build. Sarah continued to serve with distinction, eventually being promoted to commander and assigned to develop new training curricula for the entire Navy. Her expertise was recognized at the highest levels, and her influence on military training philosophy extended far beyond the dramatic incident that had made her famous. The empty chair in the SEAL team meeting room had been filled by a younger, more professional warrior who understood the importance of respect and humility in all interactions. Morrison's replacement had been thoroughly briefed about the standards expected and the consequences of failing to meet them. Morrison's broken arm served as a permanent reminder that actions have consequences, especially for those who mistake arrogance for strength. His story became a cautionary tale that would be told for generations, ensuring that his moment of poor judgment would continue teaching valuable lessons about respect, professionalism, and the true meaning of strength.